Edwin Bosso, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're going to talk a bit about how the coronavirus is going to change the way that companies do business going forward. And I'm wondering if you could tell me if you actually think that every business is capable of changing its operations or at least tweaking them as a result of the pandemic.
I think the first thing we need to consider is, how the coronavirus is going to impact the world, right? It's not going to be a one-time hit. There are a number of very complex ripple effects of that, and there are different layers of that. Starting with the effect on the healthcare system, health in general, going on to the effect on the financial systems, for example, and then on to being mixed with other things, that the oil crisis, etc. So it's going to be a very, very complex mix of impacts. Assuming that business can readjust and sustain themselves through the crisis itself, I think when they get to the end of the other side of it, what's going to be important is to be able to look at not only how the crisis may have impacted them, their processes, their supply chain, etc., but also to look back at some of the issues that they had before that, and that the crisis has contributed to surface. So I think it's going to be a wide variety of impacts on a lot of different businesses, but the easiest or the clearest way, at least in my mind, to figure out what that impact is and what the way to address it is to be able to conduct an analysis that's going to provide, what are the true impacts to a specific business as opposed to dealing in generalities.
Yeah.
You're going to have a lot of people making a lot of different scenarios about how the world is going to change, but I think it's going to impact each business very specifically according to their own strengths and weaknesses.
So it actually helps companies to understand what their weaknesses were even before this started. So it's a good opportunity. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I talk about it in 6,000 Dreams about some of the drivers of change. And I think that one of the things we talked about is, one of the things I talk about is how some companies ignore changes, reasons for change, or ignore the triggers. And I think what the crisis does is that it surfaces all of that. And now there are two things that happen. On the one hand, you have no choice but to react. And on the other hand, you don't have to make the case for change because it's obvious to your leadership team that something needs to happen. So you're basically given a license to conduct a proper analysis and structure a transformation that may make you a better business after this.
These are very uncertain times. A lot of companies are sheltering in place or locked down in response to the virus, but now they want to know, how do they emerge from this crisis mode? What advice would you have to companies that are looking for an exit from this particular situation?
Well, the first thing is to assume that these companies will have survived this, and there's there's really 5 things that I think that companies to focus on. The first one is people. This crisis impacts companies, but with companies we also mean people, their employees, their customers, right? So the first thing is to reassure their people and to find that stability for people to have their mind into what they have to do. A second thing that they need to think about is cash. They may have implemented ways through this process on how to conserve cash. The third item is how their infrastructure will have been impacted, whether it's the supply chain or whether it's having to move locations, etc. And then, you also have to think about the whole structure of decision making. What will have happened during the crisis is that companies that had very structured decision making processes, that had employees that were enabled to work independently, will have fared through this a lot better than others. And then finally, the customer, right? What will have happened to the customer? Will my customer have survived this? How will my customer have adapted? Understanding this 5 dimension is going to be, a very way for people to have a structured process out of the crisis. They've stabilized things, they get on the other side of it, and now conduct very, very structured process of understanding what problem are we trying to solve. Another thing we talk about in the book, what were we dealing with before the crisis? What did the crisis do to us? What issues has the crisis surfaced that were issues from a long time ago? And what are some of the impacts that we may want to address in the transformation? So just being calm, just navigating this, avoiding making knee-jerk reactions during the crisis, making sure that we focus on tactics, so that at the end of this, we can really take the time to structure transformation programs that address all of these points that I just talked about.
I think you're using the word transformation as a word that has real meaning. It's more than a buzzword because coming out of this on the other side, supply chains and companies are in fact going to be transformed. Can you suggest how they'll look? I mean, will it mean that their sourcing strategies will be different completely, where they get product, how many people they employ, where those people are, how they go about doing business? I mean, what might they look like on the other end of this crisis?
Potentially all of those things, right? But I think what I'll argue is that the worst place to be making long-term plan is when you're taking blows, right? So I think it's very important to show leadership. It's very important once you've stabilized things to deal with the tactics, because you don't want to compromise your long-term strategy just with dealing with tactics, because the reality is that we will make predictions, but nobody really understands how this world is going to shape up. So what I suggest that people don't do is that they start making wholesale changes, because they don't know what's going to happen to their customers. But they need to conduct proper exercise of understanding what is changing and how to address it. An example is companies saying that in Europe, well, after this crisis, we're going to be moving, a lot more of our supply chain that was in Asia. We're going to be moving that to North Africa. Or in the case of the U.S., we're talking about having a resurgence of the maquiladoras on the southern borders. These are speculations, and you don't want to be making long-term strategic decisions now that all of these things are just speculation. If instead you stabilize things, you go through the process and you watch what is happening, and as the economy starts to reopen, and as you have the opportunity to move and to spend more and more time face to face as a leadership team, what you want to be doing is structure very, very in-depth analysis program that surface your weakness. Because if you drive change without it being based on true problems that you're trying to solve, you're setting yourself up for failure. So my contention is that you have to structure good transformation programs that have the potential to make you stronger, but you can only do that at the back of a good understanding of the reasons why you need to change. That's also the best vehicle to take your people along.
But meanwhile, you do have to deal with your people. You have to figure out how to keep your workers engaged, how to deal with morale problems, how to deal with fear among employees, uncertain about whether they're going to even continue to have jobs, where they're going to be working. How can you deal with the people aspect of it in the short term to make sure you're going forward with everybody on the same page?
Well, my rule number one of leadership is authenticity. People do not expect that you're always going to give them good news. But what they expect that will happen is that you will always tell them the truth as much as you can. You will tell them what you know and what you don't know. You will make them part of the solution. Just doing that during the crisis, because everybody's going to, experience the fear that we just talked about. Everybody's going to experience the uncertainty that we talked about, including you as a leader. So the first thing to do is to acknowledge that people are experiencing those feelings, and ensure that, as you communicate with them, you try to be as upfront and as honest as possible, and more importantly, that you make them part of the solution. If you make your employees part of the solution, you will keep them engaged through this process, and that's half of the battle. Once you get people engaged through the process, then the communication becomes easier, the work towards the stability of the business becomes easier, and the transformation work after the process is also made a lot easier.
Yeah. Organizationally, though, why do you think some companies still push back against this type of change? Why do they stick to their old ways, even if their very survival is at stake for not going forward?
Yeah, it's again, this is something that I talk about in 6,000 Dream. It's a very complex process. There's a lot of different reasons why leaders act the way they act. It could be the mindset, the fact that they are very comfortable, and change, transformation or change brings an element of uncertainty that they're not equipped to deal with. It could be that they are prioritizing the urgent versus what is important. Being a leader, there's a lot of pressures, there's a lot of expectations. Dealing with the day-to-day may cause a situation where you don't have time to plan what may be the best thing for the business. It could be a misalignment of incentive. If you look at how the corporations work today, there's a big focus on the short-term results, short-term returns, and at the same time, we're challenging them with making transformational changes that best for the long term. So finding that balance is not always easy. It could be courage, it could be arrogance. There's a very complex process. But what I will say is that it's too easy to fault the leaders too quickly. We have to accept that it's a process that's complex. And I think what we offer in terms of solution is mechanisms by which leaders can break out of that and free themselves to really thinking about what is the best thing for the organization, what's the best thing for the employees, what's the best thing for the customers. And there are ways to work through this process.
I do want to cite the book in which you address these issues in much greater detail, and it's 6,000 Dreams, The Leader's Guide to a Successful Business Transformation Journey. Edwin Bosso, thank you so much for joining us today to give us kind of a brief overview of some of these steps that companies can be taking in order to address the coronavirus pandemic and emerge on the other side as transformed companies. Thanks very much for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you very much.